If you want to raise a great soybean crop, one of the most important things you need to do is fertilize your soybeans every time you plant soybeans, unless of course you have ridiculously high levels of fertility already in the ground.
Our genetics in soybeans are super capable of doing 70, 80, 90, 100 bushel yields if we just feed them right and eliminate some of the other yield limiting factors.
Okay, so when we start talking about soybeans and fertility, one of the things that I like to get to first is potassium. The reason why is because soybeans need a tremendous amount of potassium. If I take a 60 bushel soybean crop compared to a 200 bushel corn crop, for example, my 60 bushel beans need more K, period. So I've got to get a lot of available K, especially a lot of available K late in the season. And this gets to be an issue because if you're going to have a lot of potassium coming available, the potassium gets into the plant with water. If you don't have some late season rain, we are not going to have very good yields. That's why we always say August rains make beans. It's not as much because of the rain sometimes. It's because we get a lot more potassium into the plant. Every day in August, at least in our area, our plants need just a huge amount of potassium. And the trouble with potassium is most of the potassium in our soils is in the form of a rock. It's not going to come available real quickly. So that's why we have to fertilize with potassium, both deep in the soil and shallow in the soil, so we're able to take advantage of any moisture we might have deep. And obviously we have a lot of roots shallow too. So it's placement, it's availability, it's total quantity. Potassium, in my opinion, is the #1 yield limiting factor in most soybean fields I look at around the country. 60 bushel soybean crop needs about 130 pounds of potassium. Now granted, not all that's going to leave the field in the grain. There's roughly half of that that's going to stay in the stover if you leave the stover out there. But still, that's a tremendous amount of potassium. And then we need about, your 60 bushel bean crop is going to need roughly 60 pounds of phosphate. So you start just looking at those two nutrients. I also think about sulfur. Believe it or not, a soybean crop is going to use quite a bit of sulfur out of the ground as well, and sulfur, like nitrate, is leachable. So in other words, if you don't fertilize with sulfur every year, you might not have sulfur available for your soybean crop. Additionally, we talk a lot about micronutrients. That's something that, it probably only will cost you $5, maybe $10 an acre to put all the micronutrients out there you need for a 60, 70, maybe 80 bushel crop. But if you don't do that, then that might be your yield limiting factor. And that's the last thing you want to have happen is $5 or $10 holds you back on your last 10 or 15 bushels of yield.
But how about adding more nitrogen to the program?
Well, let's start by saying this. A soybean seed is a very nutrient-dense seed. It needs a lot of potassium, a lot of phosphorus, a lot of sulfur and micronutrients like we already talked about, but it also needs a lot of nitrogen. Did you know that for every bushel of soybeans, you're roughly going to need 5 to 6 pounds of nitrogen? So if we start talking 60 bushel beans, you're 300 pounds roughly of nitrogen. That's a lot. Well, the soybean crop can produce a lot of its own nitrogen through nodulation, but that's only going to happen if you have good bacteria levels in the soil, you inoculate, you have decent soil pH, you have a good environment for soil life, you have good drainage, all those kind of things. And even that being said, at peak times, peak needs during the season, there's a very good chance that your soybean crop just isn't going to be able to pull enough nitrogen out. So your choice is either have a really high level of organic matter in your soil so you get free release of nitrogen, or you're going to have to supplement with some nitrogen. We do it on our farm by putting some nitrogen out early in the season. We've also done some tests, side dressing at R1, R2, R3, something like that. Basically, I'm talking first flower to first pod, kind of in that range. Get some extra nitrogen out. If nothing else, at least try a little bit on your farm, because all I can tell you is we have seen some yield gain by putting additional nitrogen on soybeans, especially in fields where we haven't planted soybeans very often in the past.
There's a new biological product out called Challenge 2050 that is actually mycorrhizae fungi that can bring phosphorus into plants. We tried that in the furrow with soybeans. We actually had some pretty nice yield gains, and we saw a good deal more phosphorus on our tissue tests coming into the plant when we were adding that biological. It's something we're going to look at more going into next year. We had results on corn and on soybeans this year that were really positive, gave us a good return on investment. So we'll be looking at that again going into this next year and using it on more acres.
The other big thing we get questions on is, can I put fertilizer in furrow? Yes, you absolutely can. Just keep that fertilizer rate really low. On our farm, I like to stay at a gallon, maybe 2 gallons at the most. Dilute that down with some water. Put some micronutrients in there, a little bit of NP and K.
But that's
that'd
in
probably
furrow.
be okay.
You know, if you can go just off to the side, maybe you're in
Yeah,
a
then
2
you
by
can put a
2 or
lot
something
more.
like that, you can use a pretty good shot because you've got
Yes.
a nice buffer then of soil in between your fertility and your soybean seed. The other thing that we're seeing more farmers do across the country is using strip till on soybeans, because now you can put 5 or 6 inches in between the bean and where that fertility is at. You can drop that seed right above where you put fertility in the fall, which is a fantastic way to go too.
I always say to guys, if you treat your soybeans like you treat your corn, you'd probably have a lot greater yield. I know we've seen tremendous yield increases by having good fertility out there, and I believe that in many cases you will too.
Well, you're talking about comparing corn and soybeans. One of the biggest challenges in soybeans that isn't quite as much a challenge in corn is controlling our weed of the week. We'll show you how coming up next.